What if your boss was watching, and you had no idea? When a struggling cook mutters why she can't afford rent, she thinks no one's listening. But hidden in the crowd is the last person she'd ever expect. And what he does next, no one saw coming. The smell of sizzling oil and freshly toasted buns filled the air inside Fast Bite Deli, one of the many franchises under the Horizon Foods empire. The evening rush had died down, leaving behind a quiet hum of machinery and exhausted employees wiping down counters. Lisa Carter wiped the sweat off her forehead with the back of her hand. The kitchen felt hotter than usual after a 12-hour shift, her body aching from standing all day. She glanced at the clock mounted on the wall near the break room. Another grueling shift had come and gone, but her paycheck would barely cover rent this month. This isn't sustainable, she muttered under her breath. A fellow cook beside her, a younger guy named Eric, shot her a cautious look. Better keep that to yourself, he whispered, tilting his head toward the manager's office. Carter doesn't like it when people complain. Lisa sighed, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand, stacking trays of frozen patties in the back freezer. But the knot in her stomach tightened. It wasn't just her. Everyone here worked long hours, stretching every paycheck just to survive. Yet, no one dared to speak up. Across the dining area, a man in his late 50s sat at a corner booth, blending in among the scattered late-night customers. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, a button-down shirt, but there was an air of quiet authority about him. Daniel Harper, CEO of Horizon Foods, picked up a fry and examined it before taking a bite. The taste was fine, but that wasn't why he was here. Over the past few months, something had felt off. Reports about employee dissatisfaction, high turnover, and underreported wages had made their way to his desk. Numbers on a spreadsheet could be manipulated, but reality couldn't. If something was wrong with his company, he wanted to see it for himself. And now, sitting in this small, unremarkable franchise, he was seeing it unfold in real time. From the kitchen, a voice caught his attention. Not enough hours, but too much work. I barely make rent, and I'm here all the damn time. Lisa's words hung in the air for only a moment before another voice cut in, sharp, condescending. Nobody's forcing you to stay. Lisa, the manager, Stephen Carter, stepped into view, arms crossed over his chest. He was a tall, heavy-set man with a permanent sneer, the kind of person who thrived on having control over others. You think this company owes you something? Carter scoffed, shaking his head. Let me tell you something, sweetheart. Fast Bite Deli isn't a charity. If your paycheck isn't enough, pick up another shift. That's how it works. Lisa clenched her jaw, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. She wanted to say something, to push back, but she knew better. Arguing with Carter meant risking her job. And right now, she couldn't afford that. Daniel watched closely, his expression unreadable. His fingers drummed lightly against the table as he processed what he had just witnessed. The exchange had lasted barely a minute, but it told him everything he needed to know. The employees were afraid, not just of losing their jobs, but of speaking up at all. A system built on fear didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate, designed. Daniel set his tray aside, took one last sip of his coffee, and stood up. He didn't need to stay any longer. He had seen enough. As he stepped out into the cool Chicago night, his mind was already moving ahead. Horizon Foods was rotting from the inside, and he was going to find out just how deep the decay went. The city lights flickered against the glass panels of Horizon Foods headquarters, a towering structure in the heart of downtown Chicago. Inside, the hum of computers and distant voices filled the late-night air. Daniel Harper sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen, fingers drumming lightly against the desk. The restaurant visit earlier that evening had left him with a bitter taste, one that had nothing to do with the food. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. If what he had witnessed at Fast Bite Deli was just a glimpse of a larger issue, he needed to find out how deep it ran. Opening the company's internal database, Daniel navigated to the payroll reports for Fast Bite Deli. Lines of numbers filled the screen, meticulously organized, seemingly flawless. But something felt off. His eyes narrowed as he compared the labor cost to the total hours logged. The numbers didn't add up. Employees were clocking in long hours, Yet the reported payroll remained suspiciously low. According to the official records, overtime expenses were minimal, almost non-existent, but that didn't align with what he had seen. Workers like Lisa Carter struggling to afford rent despite working relentless shifts. Scrolling further, Daniel pulled up reports submitted by store manager Stephen Carter. Revenue had steadily increased, yet there was no indication of wage growth. What stood out even more was the lack of employee feedback. No complaints, no concerns. That was impossible. Every corporate business had grievances, especially in retail and food service. Yet, according to these records, Fast Bite Deli operated like a dream. No payroll disputes. No reports of overwork. Nothing. Daniel's jaw tightened. The absence of complaints was more alarming than their presence. It meant someone was actively silencing them. He needed answers. Leaning forward, he grabbed his phone and dialed Emily Dawson, Horizon Foods head of human resources. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice even. "I need to talk to you about the payroll discrepancies at our Fast Bite locations." There was a brief pause. Then, her voice came through, measured, careful. "What kind of discrepancies?" Daniel tapped his fingers on the desk. "Overtime is through the roof, but reported payroll remains flat. That doesn't make sense." A longer silence. Then, Emily cleared her throat. "Our franchise managers are given flexibility to adjust staffing and costs as they see fit. It's part of our cost control initiative." "Cost control?" Daniel repeated. "So, we're cutting expenses by underpaying employees?" "That's not what I said," Emily replied, her tone firm. "Each location operates independently within legal guidelines. If there were actual violations, don't you think we would have heard about them?" Her response was too polished, too rehearsed. "Unless someone's making sure we don't," Daniel said, testing the waters. Emily hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. "Daniel, if you're concerned, I can have my team review the reports again. But I can assure you, everything is in order." He wasn't convinced. She was hiding something. Daniel ended the call, setting the phone down slowly. If Emily wasn't willing to tell him the truth, he'd have to find someone who would. Andrew Cole. The name had come up in past reports, an ex-employee who had left Fast Bite Deli under murky circumstances. If anyone knew what was really happening, it was him. The next evening, Daniel arrived at a small cafe on the city's north side. The place was quiet, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. Andrew was already there, sitting at a corner table, fingers tapping anxiously against his cup. He was younger than Daniel expected, maybe late 20s, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "You're a hard man to track down," Daniel said, sliding into the seat across from him. Andrew let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, when you get on Carter's bad side, disappearing feels like the best option." Daniel leaned in slightly. "Tell me what happened." Andrew exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It wasn't just the long hours. Carter forced us to work extra shifts without pay. If you complained, he'd cut your hours entirely or make your life hell until you quit." Daniel listened carefully, his mind racing. "And the payroll records? They show almost no overtime expenses." Andrew smirked bitterly. "That's because Carter doctored them. He logged people out early on the system while making them work past their shifts. If anyone questioned it, he'd threaten to fire them or blacklist them from other stores." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Did you report this to corporate?" Andrew scoffed. "Tried to. Sent emails. Filed a complaint. Never heard back. Then, one day, I got a call from our Emily Dawson. She told me my concerns were being reviewed. 2 weeks later, I was fired." Daniel's stomach turned. "You think she was involved?" Andrew nodded. "I don't think. I know. Either she was in on it, or she got paid to look the other way." Silence hung between them. This was bigger than just one corrupt manager. If Emily was covering for Carter, how many other locations were doing the same? As Daniel left the cafe that night, his phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line sent a chill down his spine. "You're going too far. Stop now before it's too late." No sender, no signature, just a warning. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment before locking his phone. This wasn't just about one store. It was a system-wide operation. And now, someone knew he was coming for them. The morning rush had just begun at Fast Bite Deli. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. Employees moved quickly behind the counter, assembling breakfast sandwiches and ringing up orders. To them, this was just another day. But not for Daniel Harper. This time, he didn't enter as an anonymous customer. He walked through the front doors with the unmistakable presence of authority. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, his steps were measured, deliberate. The casual ease he had carried during his last visit was gone. Now, he was here as CEO of Horizon Foods. Lisa Carter, standing near the prep station, froze when she saw him. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, their hands pausing mid-task. Behind the register, Stephen Carter looked up from counting the till. His usual smirk faltered for just a second before he plastered it back on. "Good morning, sir," Carter said smoothly, stepping out from behind the counter. "What a surprise. We don't often get visits from the top floor." Daniel didn't return the pleasantries. He locked eyes with Carter and said, "I need to see your employee records." Now, for the briefest moment, something flickered in Carter's eyes. Then, he let out a short laugh, as if Daniel had made a joke. "Of course, though I have to admit, I'm curious. What's got the big boss personally checking up on my store?" Daniel didn't blink. "I received complaints." The room felt smaller. Employees kept their heads down, but the tension was thick enough to taste. Carter's smile thinned. "Well, I'd be happy to clear up any concerns." He gestured toward the back office. "Right this way." Daniel followed, shutting the door behind him. The office was cramped, the air slightly stale. A filing cabinet stood against the wall, papers stacked haphazardly on the desk. Carter moved toward his computer, tapping at the keyboard. "Unfortunately," he said, not sounding sorry at all, "our system's been a little finicky lately. It might take some time to pull up the files." Daniel leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "That's fine. I'll take a look at your physical records instead." Carter hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, with a casual shrug, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick binder. Daniel flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages. And immediately, discrepancies jumped out at him. Employees logging over 40 hours a week but only getting paid for 35. Overtime recorded at 0 despite extended shifts. Names that appeared one week but vanished the next. "This isn't just a mistake," Daniel said, turning another page. "This is wage theft." Carter let out a low chuckle. "Let's not get dramatic, Mr. Harper." Daniel snapped the binder shut. "Explain this." Carter leaned back against the desk, arms crossed. "It's simple. We run a tight ship. Sometimes people stay a little longer. Sometimes, the system doesn't log it right. But at the end of the day, the job gets done, and we stay profitable." Daniel's jaw tightened. "At the expense of your employees." Carter shrugged. "That's business." The casual arrogance in his tone made Daniel's blood run hot. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "You're admitting to falsifying hours," Daniel said, "to deliberately cutting wages." Carter tilted his head, eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. "You think we're the only store that does this? If we paid people for every minute they worked, we'd go under. And let's be real, most of these employees? They need the job more than the job needs them." Daniel exhaled slowly, shutting the binder with a decisive thud. "Thank you," he said. Carter frowned. "For what?" Daniel met his gaze. "For confessing." The color drained slightly from Carter's face. Before he could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Daniel turned to see a young kitchen worker standing hesitantly in the doorway. Mike, according to his name tag. Mike glanced at Carter, then quickly at Daniel. He swallowed hard before whispering, "Sir, Carter's not the only one." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Mike hesitated, then stepped inside, lowering his voice. "He's got someone backing him. Someone in corporate." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Who?" Mike's eyes darted nervously toward Carter, then back to Daniel. "Emily Dawson," he said. "She's been covering for him." Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Emily Dawson. She had lied to him. Daniel straightened, giving Mike a brief nod before turning back to Carter. The manager had gone rigid, his fingers gripping the desk just a little too tightly. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then he walked out, leaving Carter standing in the suffocating silence of his own office. The elevator ride to the executive floor of Horizon Foods was silent. But Daniel Harper's mind was anything but. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at his reflection in the metal doors. His own company, his own employees, and yet, something had been rotting beneath the surface, hidden behind polished reports and carefully managed numbers. Emily Dawson was part of it. The moment he had left Fast Bite Deli, he had called his assistant and demanded a meeting with the head of human resources before the end of the day. Now, as the doors slid open, he stepped onto the executive floor, walking past the glass offices that overlooked the Chicago skyline. Emily was already waiting in the conference room when he arrived, her expression unreadable. She sat at the long glass table, a tablet and notebook neatly placed in front of her, the picture of professionalism. When Daniel entered, she stood, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Harper," she said smoothly, "what can I do for you?" Daniel didn't bother with pleasantries. He set his laptop down on the table and opened it, pulling up the payroll reports from Fast Bite Deli. With a few clicks, he projected them onto the conference room screen. Emily glanced at the numbers, her expression neutral. "I assume this is about the reports you asked me about yesterday," she said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "It is." He gestured toward the screen. "These numbers don't make sense. Employees working long hours but not getting paid for overtime. Payroll expenses suspiciously low despite extended shifts. Complaints disappearing. Tell me why." Emily folded her hands in her lap. "All of our locations operate within corporate guidelines," she said. "Any payroll discrepancies are the responsibility of individual store managers. If there's an issue, I can have my team look into it." "But," Daniel cut her off, "you already knew." For the first time, something flickered across her face. It was brief, just a fraction of hesitation, but he caught it. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. Daniel didn't take his eyes off her. "You approved these reports. Your signature is on them." He pulled up another document, this time a scanned copy of payroll approvals. There, in black and white, was her name. Emily's shoulders tensed, but she kept her voice even. "I review hundreds of reports a week. I trust my regional managers to handle these matters correctly. If there was an oversight, it wasn't intentional." Daniel tapped a finger against the table. "Let's not waste time. I know Carter was doctoring hours at Fast Bite Deli. I know employees were working unpaid overtime. And I know this isn't just one store. So, I'll ask you again. Who told you to approve these?" Emily let out a slow breath. Then, she laughed softly. "You really think this was my idea?" Daniel stayed silent, waiting. After a moment, Emily's posture shifted. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "You don't understand how this works, do you? Then explain it to me," Daniel said. She studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the glass walls of the conference room, as if making sure no one was watching. "If I tell you the truth, do you guarantee I won't lose my job?" she asked quietly. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "I'm not looking to punish you, Emily. I'm looking for the person at the top." She was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Mark Leland," she said. "He's the one pulling the strings." Daniel's stomach clenched. Mark Leland, the company's chief operating officer, one of the most powerful executives in Horizon Foods. The man responsible for overseeing the entire chain's daily operations. If he was behind this, then the corruption didn't just run deep, it ran all the way to the top. Emily sat back in her chair. "You think you can fix this?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at the payroll reports on the screen, at the numbers that had been manipulated under his watch. Then he closed his laptop and stood. "The game has just begun," he said. Emily didn't try to stop him as he walked out. But he knew one thing for certain. Mark Leland had no idea what was coming. Daniel Harper sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. The skyline of Chicago stretched beyond the glass windows behind him. But his focus was locked on one name, Mark Leland. Over the years, Daniel had dealt with his fair share of corporate manipulators, executives who bent the rules, massaged numbers, and played power games behind closed doors. But Mark was different. He wasn't just a high-level executive running daily operations. He was also a major shareholder, deeply entrenched in the company's leadership. If Daniel went after him, this wouldn't just be about uncovering payroll fraud. It would be a battle for control of Horizon Foods itself. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Mark had spent years consolidating power, surrounding himself with people who owed him favors or feared crossing him. The fraudulent payroll system wasn't just about cutting costs. It was part of a larger strategy, one that kept certain people rich while keeping workers too afraid to speak up. Daniel knew one thing for certain: if he wanted to take Mark down, he needed to be strategic. Instead of confronting him directly, he would start by watching him in his natural habitat. The executive board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Daniel planned to use it to test the waters, to see how Mark reacted when the topic of payroll discrepancies came up. When Daniel walked into the conference room the next day, Mark was already there, casually leaning back in his chair, chatting with other executives. He was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, his demeanor one of effortless confidence. As the meeting began, discussions revolved around expansion plans, cost-cutting measures, and quarterly revenue. Mark spoke with authority, his voice steady and composed. He was good at this, keeping conversations focused where he wanted them. Then Daniel shifted the subject. I came across some irregularities in our payroll reports for certain fast bite locations, he said. His voice was calm, measured. Specifically, stores where overtime numbers don't align with reported wages. For a brief second, Mark's fingers paused against the armrest of his chair. It was almost imperceptible, but Daniel caught it. Then, Mark chuckled lightly. That's to be expected, he said smoothly. Franchise management can be messy. Small miscalculations happen all the time. Daniel held his gaze. A small miscalculation? Mark nodded. Absolutely, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel leaned back slightly, pretending to consider the answer. He could feel the eyes of the other board members shifting between the two of them. Mark was playing this carefully, downplaying everything. He wasn't worried, not yet. But he would be. The meeting wrapped up shortly after, and as the executives filed out, Daniel stayed behind, watching Mark as he exchanged pleasantries with a few of his allies before finally heading for the exit. This wasn't going to be easy. And Mark had just made his first move. The next morning, Emily Dawson resigned. Daniel found out through an automated email from our. Emily Dawson has voluntarily resigned from her position. All relevant files and communications will remain confidential per company policy. Daniel tried calling her, but the number was disconnected. He sent an email, but it bounced back. It was as if she had vanished overnight. This wasn't a coincidence. Emily had been his first real source of information. And now she was gone. Either she had been bought off, or worse, scared into silence. Daniel sat at his desk, gripping his phone tightly. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected it to come this fast. As he stood, preparing to leave for the day, a man stepped into his path just outside his office. The stranger was tall, dressed in a dark suit, with a calm expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Without a word, he handed Daniel a black folder. Take my advice, the man murmured. Walk away. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Then he turned and disappeared down the hallway before Daniel could even respond. Slowly, Daniel opened the folder. Inside were photographs. His wife, his son, candid shots of them outside their home, at a cafe, walking through a park. A cold sensation crawled down his spine. Mark wasn't just fighting to protect his system. He was sending a message. This wasn't about business anymore. It was personal. Daniel Harper had spent years earning the respect of his employees. But that respect now felt like a distant memory. As he walked through the corridors of Horizon Foods headquarters, he could sense the shift. Conversations would hush when he passed by. People exchanged knowing glances. Some even avoided eye contact altogether. Mark Leland had begun his counterattack. The strategy was obvious: create doubt, isolate Daniel, and weaken his influence from within. It wasn't just a battle of evidence anymore. It was a war of perception. Back in his office, Daniel sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. He had barely begun to dig deeper into Mark's role in the payroll fraud. And now the ground beneath him was shifting. He needed to move fast. Then, an email popped into his inbox. It was from the Internal Audit Department. The subject line read, "Urgent, suspicious financial activity detected." Daniel clicked it open. The message was brief but damning. A recent review has uncovered an unauthorized wire transfer of $2 million from a Horizon Foods corporate account linked to your credentials. The funds were sent to an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands. Please provide an immediate explanation. Daniel stared at the screen, his heartbeat slowing. He hadn't authorized any such transfer. This was a setup. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he accessed the company's financial records. The transaction had been executed under his name, using his executive credentials, but the timestamps didn't make sense. It had been initiated while he was at the executive board meeting. Someone had forged his digital approval, and that someone had access to the highest security levels within the company. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His assistant, Claire, stood there, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harper, they've called an emergency board meeting. It's about the audit report." Daniel exhaled. Of course they did. 15 minutes later, he sat at the long glass conference table, surrounded by the board members he had once considered allies. Mark Leland sat across from him, looking completely at ease. His suit was impeccable, his demeanor calm. He even wore a faint smile, as if this was just another routine discussion. The chairman of the board, Alan Wright, folded his hands on the table and cleared his throat. "Daniel, the audit team has uncovered a major financial discrepancy under your authorization. A $2 million transfer to an offshore account. Can you explain this?" Daniel met his gaze steadily. "I didn't authorize that transfer. This is fraud." Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Daniel, I'd like to believe that, but the evidence suggests otherwise." He gestured toward a printed report in front of him. "It was done using your credentials. Your approval signature is logged in the system." Daniel's jaw tightened. That signature was forged. Someone with high-level access manipulated the records. Mark tilted his head. "Then perhaps you should be more careful with your security." A murmur spread through the room. The implication was clear. Mark was framing this as Daniel's negligence at best, or outright embezzlement at worst. Alan Wright turned to him again. "Daniel, until we can verify what happened, we need to take precautions. Effective immediately. We're placing you on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation." Daniel's stomach turned. "You're suspending me?" Mark spread his hands in a mock gesture of sympathy. "It's the responsible course of action. Surely, you understand." Daniel held his gaze. He understood perfectly. Mark wasn't just attacking his reputation, he was stripping him of his power. Without official access, Daniel wouldn't be able to investigate further. He wouldn't be able to rally his allies. He would be a ghost in his own company. The board voted unanimously. The decision was final. By the time Daniel returned to his office, his assistant was waiting for him, her face pale. "They've locked you out of the system," she said. "Your login credentials have been revoked." Daniel Harper, CEO of Horizon Foods, was now an outsider in the company he built. Mark Leland had made his first move, but Daniel wasn't about to back down. Daniel Harper had never been one to sit still, and he wasn't about to start now. Mark Leland might have stripped him of his authority at Horizon Foods, but Daniel still had one thing left: his determination. If he wanted to fight back, he needed evidence, not just suspicions, not just accusations, but something concrete, something that even Mark couldn't explain away. Sitting in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Chicago, Daniel scrolled through internal company files on his tablet. He had spent the past few days piecing together fragments of data, looking for anything that could expose the truth. Then, a name surfaced: Richard Hale, the former chief financial officer of Horizon Foods. Richard had once been one of the company's most trusted executives, until he was suddenly forced out under vague circumstances. No official reason had ever been given. The company statement at the time had called it a restructuring decision. But Daniel knew better. Mark had made sure Richard disappeared. And now, Richard might be the only person who could prove what Mark had been doing behind the scenes. Daniel had to find him. The problem was, Richard Hale had vanished. No LinkedIn updates, no public records of employment since his departure. It was as if he had erased himself. Daniel needed help. He reached out to Mike, The fast-bite kitchen worker who had warned him about Emily Dawson. Mike had connections, former employees, disgruntled managers, people who had left Horizon Foods under less than ideal circumstances. A day later, Mike called him back. I found him, Mike said, his voice low. Took some digging, but Richard's been laying low in a small town outside Madison, Wisconsin. Bought a house under his wife's maiden name. Looks like he wanted to disappear. Daniel didn't hesitate. Within an hour, he was on the road. The drive was long, but his mind stayed sharp. He replayed every conversation, every clue, every mistake he had made that led him here. Mark had been 2 steps ahead of him at every turn. But this time, Daniel was moving first. By the time he arrived at Richard's house, the sky had begun to darken. The place was modest, a single-story home with a sagging porch and a faded mailbox. Daniel knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The door cracked open just enough for him to see a pair of wary eyes. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling, Richard muttered. Daniel didn't move. I'm not here to sell anything. The door almost closed, but Daniel held it firm. I know what Mark did to you. That made Richard freeze. I know he forced you out. Daniel continued, and I know you have proof of what he's been doing. That's why I need your help. Richard sighed, rubbing his forehead. I don't want any part of this. He's framing me, Daniel said. He wants me gone, just like he did with you. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Richard stepped aside, opening the door. Come in. Inside, the house was cluttered but lived in. Old newspapers stacked in the corner. A coffee mug half filled with cold liquid sat on the kitchen table. The place felt less like a home and more like a hiding spot. Richard sat down, rubbing his hands together. I tried to stop it once, he said. I went to the board with concerns about Mark's financial reports. Money was moving, being funneled into shell corporations, disappearing into offshore accounts. When I asked too many questions, I was pushed out. Daniel leaned forward. Do you have proof? Richard nodded. He stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a small USB drive. This has everything, he said. Bank transfers, internal emails, expense reports that don't add up. It's all here. Daniel reached for it, but Richard didn't let go. His grip was firm. If you take this, Richard warned, you won't be safe. I'm already not safe, Daniel replied. Then, the headlights appeared. A black car rolled to a stop in front of the house. Richard's face went pale. They found me. The car doors opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Daniel's pulse quickened. He had to get Richard out of here. Now. Daniel Harper didn't hesitate. The moment the black car pulled up in front of Richard Hale's house, he grabbed the former CFO's arm and pulled him toward the back door. Move, Daniel ordered. Richard stumbled, still gripping the USB drive tightly in his fist. His hands were shaking, his breathing uneven. They found me, he muttered, his voice hollow. They're not taking you, Daniel said, pushing open the back door. They rushed outside into the cold night air. Daniel's car was parked in the driveway just beyond the house. But as they sprinted toward it, a loud crack split the silence. Glass shattered. The back windshield exploded into tiny shards. Richard gasped. They're shooting at us? Daniel shoved him forward. Get in. Another shot rang out, but Daniel didn't stop. He threw himself into the driver's seat and twisted the key. The engine roared to life. Tires screeched as he reversed out of the driveway, barely missing the corner of the house. In the rearview mirror, he saw the 2 men sprinting back toward their car, scrambling to follow. They're coming, Richard said, his voice shaking. Daniel gripped the wheel. I noticed. They sped onto the main road, the headlights of the black sedan appearing in the distance behind them. It was a straight shot through the small town. But once they hit the highway, Daniel knew they'd be outmatched. Whoever Mark had sent wasn't just trying to scare them anymore. This was an execution. Daniel pushed the car harder, weaving between the sparse late-night traffic. Richard was breathing heavily beside him. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Daniel said. I don't think anywhere is safe, Richard muttered. Daniel glanced at him. The older man's knuckles were white as he clutched the USB. Give it to me, Daniel said. Richard hesitated. If something happens, I need to make sure this gets out. Daniel pressed. Richard swallowed, then reluctantly placed the drive in Daniel's hand. This is everything, he said. If Mark gets his hands on it, we're both dead. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The black sedan was gaining. The road stretched ahead of them, leading toward the mountains. If they could reach the winding back roads, they might have a chance to lose their pursuers. But before they could reach the turnoff, flashing blue and red lights lit up the road ahead. A police cruiser sat in the middle of the lane, blocking their path. Daniel cursed under his breath. He glanced in the mirror. The sedan was closing in fast. The officer stepped out, raising a hand. Pull over now. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. They set us up. Daniel's mind raced. If he stopped, they were done. But if he ran, he'd have the entire police force after him. He pulled the car to a stop, his pulse hammering. The officer approached, one hand resting on his holster. Step out of the vehicle. Daniel kept his hands on the wheel. What's this about, officer? The cop smirked. Daniel Harper, you're under arrest for the theft of Horizon Foods' proprietary data. Richard stiffened. They're arresting you? Daniel exhaled slowly. Looks like it. The officer opened the door and pulled Daniel out, spinning him around to cuff his wrists. As Daniel was forced to his knees, he looked up and saw another car parked just beyond the flashing lights. Mark Leland stood beside it, arms crossed, watching. The look on his face said it all. Checkmate. For now. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Daniel Harper's wrists as he sat in the dimly lit interrogation room. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows against the plain gray walls. A single chair, a metal table, a camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. He had been through corporate battles before, boardroom negotiations, high-stakes mergers, power plays among executives. But this was different. This was an entirely new battlefield. The door creaked open. A tall man in his late 40s stepped in, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, carrying a thick folder. His presence was deliberate, calculated. This wasn't just any detective. Daniel recognized him immediately. Detective Robert Hayes. A name he had heard before. Hayes had been linked to several white-collar crime cases but had a reputation for making things disappear when the right people were involved. And right now, Daniel had no doubt whose side he was on. Hayes took his time settling into the chair across from Daniel, flipping open the folder with a slow, deliberate motion. He studied the papers inside for a long moment before finally speaking. Daniel Harper, CEO of Horizon Foods. He let the words hang in the air as if savoring them. Then he glanced up, his expression unreadable. A man like you, sitting in a place like this. Now that's something I never expected to see. Daniel didn't respond. Hayes leaned back, tapping a finger against the folder. You've been accused of stealing sensitive corporate data, unauthorized financial transactions, and if the evidence is to be believed, he raised an eyebrow. $2 million sent to an offshore account under your name. Daniel kept his face neutral. That's convenient, isn't it? Hayes smirked. What's convenient is that your login credentials were used. What's unfortunate is that these things tend to leave a paper trail. He shut the folder and folded his hands over it. I'll be honest with you, Harper. A man in your position doesn't just make a mistake like this. Which tells me one of two things. Either you were set up, or you were stupid enough to think you wouldn't get caught. Daniel met his gaze. And which one do you believe? Hayes chuckled. Does it matter? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I know you didn't do it. Silence. Daniel didn't flinch, but inside, his mind was moving fast. Hayes wasn't here to seek the truth. He was here to make sure this played out the way Mark Leland wanted. Hayes drummed his fingers on the table. Here's the thing, Harper. We both know how this ends. You can fight this and watch your entire empire collapse. Or, he shrugged, you take a deal, plead guilty to lesser charges. Maybe a fine, maybe some house arrest. You keep your dignity, and this whole thing goes away. Daniel let the words settle. Then he smirked. That's cute. Hayes exhaled, shaking his head. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Daniel leaned in slightly. And you're underestimating how much I enjoy a challenge. The detective studied him for a moment, then pushed back his chair. Suit yourself. As Hayes exited the room, The door shut with a sharp click. Daniel exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers against the cuffs. He had expected intimidation, manipulation, but something about the way Hayes had worded that deal, it wasn't just a warning. It was a script. Mark had planned this down to the last detail. Minutes passed. The room remained silent, save for the low hum of the ventilation system. Then, just as Daniel was beginning to calculate his next move, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Hayes. A younger officer stepped in, mid-30s, neatly dressed, but his eyes darted around the room as if making sure no one was watching. He walked past Daniel, seemingly ignoring him, and set a single folded piece of paper on the table. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Daniel glanced up at the camera. It was still blinking. Whoever had just done this had taken a risk. He unfolded the note. 3 simple words were written inside. Don't trust anyone. A slow chill ran down his spine. Someone else was in play. Someone inside the system. Before he could process it further, the door opened again, and Hayes returned, this time with company. A sharply dressed man in a dark suit stepped inside, his briefcase clutched neatly in one hand. His expression was polished, but the arrogance behind his eyes was unmistakable. One of Mark's lawyers. The game had officially changed. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights filled the air as Daniel Harper sat in his holding cell, staring at the blank concrete wall. The clock on the opposite side of the room ticked away the seconds, each one stretching into eternity. His court hearing was scheduled for the next morning. And if things went as Mark Leland had planned, it wouldn't be a trial, it would be an execution. He had been framed. His name was already splashed across the news as a disgraced CEO, accused of financial fraud and corporate theft. If he didn't act soon, the only thing left of his legacy would be a footnote in Horizon Foods history. Then, the unexpected happened. A commotion echoed through the station. Voices rose near the front desk, followed by the sharp clack of high heels on the tile floor. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside, her presence commanding the room before she even spoke. She was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in a sleek black suit that screamed authority. She approached the officer at the desk and set down a folder with an audible thud. "I'm Veronica Lane," she said, her voice even and firm. "Attorney for Daniel Harper. I need to see my client immediately." Daniel sat up straighter. The name meant nothing to him. He hadn't hired a lawyer yet, hadn't even had the chance. So who had sent her? Minutes later, he was led into a small interview room. Veronica was already waiting, seated at the metal table, her expression unreadable. A thick folder lay open in front of her. Daniel didn't sit immediately. Instead, he studied her. "I don't know you." "No, you don't," Veronica said calmly. "But right now, I'm the only person in this building who's actually on your side." He narrowed his eyes. "Who sent you?" Veronica's lips curled into a faint smile. "A friend. One who prefers to remain unseen for now." Daniel let the words settle. There weren't many people left who would go out of their way to help him. Mark had made sure of that. She tapped a page in the open folder. "Before you decide whether or not to trust me, you should see this." Daniel pulled out the document and scanned it quickly. It was a copy of the very same financial report that had been used to frame him. The fabricated wire transfer, the altered spreadsheets, everything was there. He looked up. "How did you get this?" Veronica leaned back in her chair. "Let's just say I have resources." Daniel exhaled slowly. "This changed things. If we can prove these documents were forged, we can take this to court." Veronica nodded but didn't look entirely pleased. "There's a problem." Of course there was. She slid her phone across the table. The screen showed a text message conversation. At the top was a name, Richard Hale. Daniel's stomach tightened. The message was short. "I'm alive, but they're closing in." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had known Richard was in danger. But this confirmed it. If Mark's people found him first, there would be no one left to verify the forged financial records. Veronica studied him carefully. "He wants to meet, but we have to move fast." Daniel nodded, already making calculations in his head. He had been trapped in a game of chess. And for the first time in days, he saw an opening. Now, he just had to make his move before Mark made his. The cold night air bit against Daniel Harper's skin as he stepped out of the police station. The weight of the past 24 hours sat heavily on his shoulders. Though Veronica Lane had secured his release, he knew this wasn't over. Mark Leland wouldn't just sit back and watch. He would retaliate. Daniel had one chance to get ahead. Find Richard Hale before Mark did. Veronica's phone buzzed as they walked toward her car. She glanced at the screen and then turned to Daniel. Richard just sent a location. He's hiding in an abandoned warehouse outside Milwaukee. Daniel exhaled sharply. That's not far. She unlocked the car, sliding into the driver's seat as Daniel got in beside her. We don't have much time, she said. If we got this message. So did Mark. Daniel nodded. Then we move now. The car roared to life as Veronica sped onto the highway, pushing the speed limit. The city lights faded into the darkness behind them as they raced toward Wisconsin. The tension in the car was thick. Daniel stared out at the road ahead, his thoughts racing as fast as the vehicle. If Mark got to Richard first, the last piece of evidence tying him to the financial fraud would be gone. As they approached the warehouse district on the outskirts of Milwaukee, Daniel's stomach sank. A black SUV was already parked outside. Mark had beaten them there. Veronica slowed the car, parking a safe distance away. She glanced at Daniel. How do you want to play this? Daniel studied the warehouse. We go in, quietly. They exited the car, moving cautiously along the side of the building. Through a cracked window, Daniel spotted movement inside. Two men, both wearing dark suits, were dragging Richard toward the back entrance. And standing in the middle of the room, watching it all unfold, was Mark Leland. Daniel clenched his jaw. Mark turned slightly, as if sensing their presence. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he spread his arms in mock welcome. Daniel Harper, Mark called out. You just don't know when to quit. Daniel stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. Let him go, Mark. Mark chuckled. I admire your persistence. Really, but let's be honest. You're out of moves. Richard struggled against the two men holding him, but they tightened their grip. Mark sighed. Let's make this simple. You walk away, right now, and we pretend none of this ever happened. Or, he tilted his head toward Richard. He disappears, permanently. Veronica tensed beside Daniel. He could feel her waiting for his decision. Daniel took a slow breath. His eyes locked on Mark. I don't play your games. Mark's smirk faltered for a brief second before he recovered. He opened his mouth to speak. Then, suddenly, the wail of police sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the warehouse windows. Tires screeched as squad cars surrounded the building. Veronica leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. I called them before we got here. Daniel glanced at her, surprised. She gave a small, knowing smile. We don't have to play by Mark's rules. Inside the warehouse, the men holding Richard hesitated, looking to Mark for instructions. For the first time since this all started, Mark didn't look quite so confident. Police officers flooded the warehouse, guns drawn, hands where we can see them. Mark clenched his fists, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. But Daniel knew Mark Leland wasn't the type to surrender easily. Did he still have one last trick up his sleeve? The sharp sound of police boots echoed through the warehouse as officers swarmed in. Their weapons drawn, their voices firm and commanding. Mark Leland stood in the center of the chaos, completely still, his expression unreadable. Unlike his men, who immediately dropped their weapons and raised their hands, Mark didn't look the least bit surprised. Instead, he smirked. As a detective approached, Mark raised his hands in mock surrender. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Daniel Harper watched from a few feet away, his pulse still racing. Richard Hale had been pulled to safety by one of the officers. Visibly shaken but alive, Veronica Lane stood beside Daniel, her hand firmly gripping a small recording device. Mark kept talking, his tone as measured as ever. I'm afraid you won't find any evidence linking me to anything illegal. And unless you're planning to arrest me based on assumptions, I'd like to leave now. The lead detective, a burly man in his 50s, narrowed his eyes. We'll see about that. One of the officers patted Mark down, searching for weapons, but he was clean. Mark had erased every trace of his crimes. The fraudulent financial records, the bribery, the threats. It had all been orchestrated so carefully. He had covered his tracks perfectly. Or at least, he thought he had. That's when Veronica stepped forward, holding up the recording device. "We have everything," she said. For the first time that night, Mark's smirk faltered. She pressed play. The warehouse filled with Mark's own voice, calm, deliberate, and damning. "If you walk away now, I'll let you live. You think you can win? I own this company. I own everyone in it. Richard Hale will disappear, and no one will ever hear from him again." Every word was crystal clear. The officers froze, listening. The detective's jaw tightened. Daniel stole a glance at Veronica. She had recorded everything. Mark's mask of confidence cracked, but only slightly. He straightened his tie, as if regaining his composure. "That recording was obtained illegally," he said, his voice sharp. "It won't hold up in court." The detective ignored him. He turned to his officers. "Cuff him." Mark's hands were wrenched behind his back, and the sound of metal clicking shut filled the room. He exhaled slowly, then turned his head toward Daniel, and smiled. "You think this is over?" Mark said quietly, his voice laced with amusement. "You think arresting me changes anything?" Daniel held his gaze. "I think it's a damn good start." Mark chuckled, shaking his head as the officers led him toward the exit. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "This system, it's bigger than you. Bigger than me. You can't fix it." Daniel didn't flinch. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe this fight was bigger than just one man. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. As Mark was pushed into the back of a squad car, Daniel felt the weight of everything settle over him. This wasn't just about Horizon Foods anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. Mark Leland was gone. The mastermind, or so Daniel Harper had thought, had been arrested. His crimes splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper. Horizon Foods COO arrested for financial fraud. Mark Leland accused of wage manipulation scheme. Years of employee exploitation uncovered. It should have been a victory. But something felt off. Horizon Foods had yet to issue an official statement. No press conferences. No internal emails to employees. No damage control. It was silence. And silence in a corporation of this size meant one thing. Someone else was pulling the strings. Then, the phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Harper." A deep, measured voice responded. "Good evening, Mr. Harper. My name is Franklin Moore." Daniel sat up straighter. He knew that name. Franklin Moore, chairman of Horizon Foods Board. The true power behind the company. "We need to talk," Moore said. Moore's office was perched high above the city skyline, in a glass-walled corner of the Horizon Foods headquarters. Unlike Mark Leland, who thrived on intimidation and control, Franklin Moore exuded something far more unsettling. Confidence. The kind that came from knowing he couldn't be touched. Moore stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows when Daniel arrived, sipping an amber-colored drink from a crystal tumbler. He didn't turn around immediately. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" Moore mused. "When you're up here, looking down at the city, everything feels manageable." Daniel wasn't in the mood for games. "Why am I here?" Moore finally turned, a faint smirk on his lips. He gestured toward the bar cart. "Drink?" Daniel ignored the offer. Moore chuckled. "Straight to business." Then, he set his glass down. "You think taking down Mark Leland changes anything?" Daniel met his gaze. "I think it's a start." Moore shook his head, almost amused. "Mark was a pawn, Mr. Harper. He did what he was told." Moore leaned against the desk, folding his arms. "You're a businessman. You understand the nature of power. Horizon Foods is more than one executive, more than one scandal. What Mark did, that was just efficiency. He was optimizing our workforce, making us more competitive." "You mean exploiting people," Daniel corrected. Moore's smile didn't falter. "Call it what you will. But let's talk about your future." Moore picked up a folder from his desk and tossed it onto the table between them. Inside were financial reports, stock projections, and a contract. "You have two options," Moore said. "Join me. Use your influence to help expand Horizon Foods. Be part of something bigger than yourself." Daniel didn't touch the folder. "And if I refuse?" Moore sighed, almost disappointed. "Then you become an obstacle. And obstacles get removed." Daniel had expected a threat. but hearing it spoken so casually made his skin crawl. He took a step closer. You think I'm scared of you? Moore smiled, shaking his head. Not yet. As Daniel walked out of the building, his phone vibrated. A single email. No sender. No subject. Just a video attachment. He hesitated, then tapped play. Grainy footage. A dark alley. A man on his knees. A gun pressed against his head. Daniel's breath caught. There was no sound, just the flash of the muzzle. The body slumping to the ground. The video ended. Daniel stared at the screen, his blood running cold. A second message appeared. You can't take down an empire. This wasn't over. Mark was just the beginning. Now, Daniel was the target. The hum of quiet conversation filled the small cafe. The scent of roasted coffee beans lingering in the air. The place was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The kind of spot where people came to disappear for an hour or two. Daniel Harper and Veronica Lane sat at a corner table, their backs to the wall, both scanning the room with cautious eyes. Neither of them had touched their drinks. Daniel slid his phone across the table. The screen still displayed the video, the final moments of Richard Hale's life. Veronica's face paled as she watched. When the screen faded to black, she exhaled shakily and set the phone down. We're dealing with something far bigger than corporate fraud, she said quietly. This isn't just about money. They're willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Daniel already knew that. He had known it the moment he watched Mark Leland smirk as he was led away in handcuffs. Mark had never been the real enemy. It was Franklin Moore, and whoever else was standing behind him. Daniel leaned forward. I need to prove Richard was murdered. Veronica hesitated. That won't be easy. Whoever did this has resources. Daniel pulled out another phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a voice answered. Harper. Ethan. Daniel said, I need your help. Ethan Crowley, an independent investigative journalist who had taken down some of the most powerful names in business and politics. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. I heard about Richard, Ethan said, but you're not gonna like what I found. Tell me, it wasn't an accident, Ethan said, it was a hit. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. The police report is bogus. Ethan continued, no real investigation, no autopsy details, no witness interviews. They closed the case before it was even open. Daniel clenched his jaw. That means Franklin Moore has more power than we thought. He's not just running Horizon Foods, Ethan said, he's got people in the police department. Maybe even higher than that. Veronica locked eyes with Daniel. If Moore has that kind of reach, we need to be careful. Exposing him could put a target on our backs. Daniel's grip tightened around his phone. There's already a target on our backs. Veronica sighed, rubbing her temples. Are you sure you want to keep going? If we push further, we may not get out of this. Daniel didn't hesitate. Richard didn't die for nothing. The moment those words left his mouth, he knew there was no turning back. Then, it happened. A low roar of an engine. The screech of tires. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. He grabbed Veronica's arm and yanked her from her chair just as a black SUV came barreling toward them. The cafe chair where Daniel had been sitting a second earlier was obliterated as the vehicle crashed into it, sending splinters and shattered glass flying. People screamed. The SUV didn't stop. It sped off, disappearing into traffic before anyone could react. Daniel lay on the ground, shielding Veronica. He could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was a kill order. Daniel helped Veronica to her feet. She was shaken but unharmed. Around them, stunned customers scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Daniel looked toward the street where the SUV had vanished. Franklin Moore had just made things personal. This wasn't about Horizon Foods anymore. This was survival. The weight of everything Daniel Harper had fought for rested on this moment. They had tried to kill him, tried to silence him, but instead of hiding, Daniel had chosen to fight back. Now, there was only one way forward, exposing Franklin Moore and tearing down the corrupt empire he had built. Inside a dimly lit motel room on the outskirts of the city, Daniel sat with Veronica Lane and Ethan Crowley. Papers covered the table, laptop screens glowed with financial statements, and the air was thick with tension. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. If we go public with this, We need undeniable proof. Otherwise, Moore will bury the story before it even sees the light of day. Veronica tapped on her laptop, scrolling through encrypted files. We have it, she said. I found a shell company that received millions from Horizon Foods over the past 3 years. The money was funneled through offshore accounts, then reinvested into a private equity fund. She turned the screen toward them. The fund is owned by Franklin Moore. Daniel exhaled sharply. That's it. That's the connection we need. Ethan nodded. This proves he wasn't just covering for Mark Leland, he was orchestrating everything. Money laundering, wage theft, corporate fraud, and now, murder. Daniel leaned forward. We hold a press conference. We leak everything to independent news sources before Moore can control the narrative. Ethan hesitated. You realize Moore won't just sit back and watch, right? Daniel's gaze hardened. I'm counting on it. The next morning, as Daniel prepared to leave for the press conference, his phone rang. A number with no caller ID. He answered. A familiar, measured voice spoke. Harper, I suggest you reconsider what you're about to do. Daniel gripped the phone tighter. Moore, you don't seem to understand how this works. Moore continued smoothly. I don't lose. Daniel said nothing. Moore sighed. If you walk onto that stage, you won't walk off it. This is your last chance to walk away. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, but his voice remained steady. See you soon, Franklin. He hung up. The moment Daniel arrived at the press venue, a breaking news alert flashed across a nearby television screen. Daniel Harper under investigation for financial fraud. Daniel froze. The news anchor spoke in a crisp tone. New allegations have surfaced, linking former Horizon Foods CEO Daniel Harper to suspicious financial activities. Sources say federal investigators are looking into offshore accounts in his name. Moore had preemptively smeared his name, planting false stories to destroy his credibility before he could speak. Veronica grabbed Daniel's arm. We have to cancel. If we go out there now, no one will believe you. Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked the message, his face going pale. We have a bigger problem. A source just told me Moore put out a kill order on you. Daniel turned to them. If we don't do this now, we never will. Veronica shook her head. You could die. Daniel took a deep breath. Then let's make it count. He stepped onto the stage. The cameras turned to him. The microphones went live. This was it. Daniel Harper stood under the glaring lights of the press conference, his heartbeat steady despite the storm swirling around him. The room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing, and voices murmuring with anticipation. This was his moment. A large screen behind him displayed financial records, offshore transactions, and shell company documents, all leading back to Franklin Moore. Then came the final piece. Daniel pressed a button on his laptop, and Mark Leland's recorded confession played over the speakers. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Franklin Moore had built an empire on fraud, corruption, and blood, and now, that empire was crumbling. Just as Daniel was about to continue, the conference room doors burst open. Police officers stormed in, their boots echoing on the marble floor. And then, behind them, walked Franklin Moore, calm, smiling, like a man who already knew how this would end. I'm afraid your little game is over, Harper, Moore said smoothly, his voice carrying over the noise. A uniformed officer stepped forward, holding up an arrest warrant. Daniel Harper, you are under arrest for financial fraud and spreading false information. A calculated move. Moore was trying to silence him. On live television, Daniel stared at the officer. You don't seriously believe this, do you? The officer hesitated, but only for a second. Turn around. Hands where I can see them. The cameras zoomed in. Moore was winning. Before the officer could cuff him, a voice cut through the chaos. I'd reconsider that arrest if I were you. All heads turned. Ethan Crowley stepped forward, holding a thick file and a folded document. He lifted it high. A federal arrest warrant, Ethan said, for Franklin Moore. The officer looked between the two men. What? Ethan smirked. You've been played, gentlemen. We sent the evidence to the FBI hours ago. Moore's face twitched. You thought you were ahead of the game. Ethan continued. But you walked right into a trap. You came here to shut Harper up. But instead, you exposed yourself. Another group of officers entered. Not local police, federal agents. Moore's smug expression faded. One of the agents stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. Franklin Moore, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The cameras captured everything. The great Franklin Moore, the untouchable man, was led away in cuffs. As he passed Daniel, he paused, just for a second. Then he smirked. You think this is over? He whispered. The system is bigger than you. Daniel met his gaze, unshaken. Then I guess I'll have to keep fighting. Moore chuckled as he was taken away. As the press swarmed Daniel, he knew this wasn't truly the end. Yes, Moore was finished. Yes, Mark Leland was in prison. But the machine they built? It was still running. And somewhere, in the shadows, someone else was waiting to take Moore's place. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And so, the truth came to light, but was it enough? Exposing corruption is one thing. But real change? That takes more than just one man. Daniel Harper fought back, but how many more secrets are still buried? How many more voices go unheard? What do you think? Can one person truly stand against a broken system? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more hidden truths uncovered, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths, because sometimes the real story is the one they don't want you to hear.